Okay, I seem to be live now, and I was talking to myself for a few moments because I'm still working out how this system works, and so I apologize if you can hear me. Please say hello on the chat just so I can know that the chat is working and also that you're hearing me on the live stream, because this is a test of the new YouTube system. They're giving me more information but less in strange ways. Can you hear me? Hey, Sean, can you hear me okay? I guess you can. Good evening, Alchemist's daughter. Great. Hi, Dan. How are you? Nice to see you. Okay. All right. So last week I missed your chats, and there were a few items from last week that I thought maybe I should go through. I'm not going to do them all because you folks got off on some interesting tangents, but I will answer Thomas Dennis's question about whether my police car vision emerges when I have been drinking. And I haven't tested this properly, Thomas, because I have not, I normally do not drink and drive, and I don't recommend that to others. I do. Some people say, as they did on this chat, that your senses get heightened a little bit if you have a little beer in you. Maybe for a little bit, but I don't think for a lot. And so I don't recommend drinking and driving, and I don't have any test of the question. And Alchemist's daughter made a good statement at the end of last week where she said that it's becoming clear that there is a real battle for our consciousness, and that is definitely true. And there are very many layers of consciousness. And so you live and learn. You have an experience of something that might be negative. Let's suppose you get into a little fender bender where you hit another car from the rear because you weren't paying attention enough. Well, that raises your consciousness about paying attention while you're driving. And but there are just too many things to talk about. And actually, when we're going to school, our consciousness is constantly being raised. When we're born, we're basically wild animals, and we learn by imitating our parents. And gradually we get into imitating teachers, and the teachers tell us what the letters mean and what the numbers mean. And gradually they raise our consciousness. That's what we're talking about here. It's not just being awake. Consciousness is not just being awake. Consciousness is being aware of many things and being able to put 2 + 2 together. And so the new level of consciousness that we're working toward in religion, at first, people were pretty much doing what they wanted, but they were staying in groups. And then Moses came off the mountain with the 10 Commandments. And that was before 1000 BC, about maybe 1200 BC, if I recall correctly. And so so that was culture starting to recognize that we needed laws to sort of handrails for our culture. And if we think about it in terms of rationality, let's see. Sean sent me a good quote today, which I had printed out, but what did I do with it? Oh my goodness. Okay, here it is. So Sean sent me a good quote today. And this is from Emma Jung. She says, "A man who rules over the word or over meaning represents an essentially intellectual tendency, because word and meaning correspond par excellence to mental capacity." Well, that's true, but we can't do everything by our mental capacity, because we're animals too. And I was thinking today that, thinking and feeling, the feeling part is really about being closer to our instincts. And so you can see this. I never really noticed it with the women in my life, but about 4 or 5 years ago, my mother-in-law started to watch these video cams, live video cams on birds' nests. And we have a very fine one in the Chesapeake Bay that points at an osprey nest. And so this time of year, every year, an osprey comes into that nest, and it's the same osprey every year, the same female. And she, but often it's, if I recall correctly, the protocol is the male arrives first, and it's normally the same male unless he's been killed on the trip to Brazil and back over the winter. And then he won't come back. If he does come back, his job is to make a nest for the female, and that will be the same female as last year. And then you can watch the whole process of their mating and the eggs being laid, and right up through the babies being born after 40 days after the eggs are laid. And then after about 2 months, they fly away from the nest, or start flying away from the nest, and a month later they're on a 5,000-mile trip to Brazil. And so that's all instinctual behavior. And my wife and my mother-in-law are quite enamored with these things, and they're always watching these live streams from Africa or wherever. And they're quite interesting, I must say. I find them interesting also. But I am not gaga the way my mother-in-law is. I mean, when that osprey nest is in operation, she'll want to watch it 7/24. And so it's said that women tend to be closer to instinct than men are. And that's an example of that. And so the point is that we can lionize rationality and the word and meaning, but we also have to live, and we are animals. And as animals, we have to honor our instincts. And so anyway, tonight I thought, let me just look at your comments here. Sean says, do you think in the future they will be able to measure impulsivity and give you a sort of tendency map for parents or newborns? Yeah, I suppose there's that sort of thing happening now, but I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't think you necessarily want to pin down your kids to one tendency or another at the beginning. They need to explore and learn what's possible. And that's what childhood is about. So when fathers tend to be too strict, for example, obviously it's very irritating to the child or the teenager. And, those things cause problems right from the start. And so you're better off, they give some overview of Jungian psychology. And the reason is that 3 years ago when I started this program, I did talk about an overview of Jungian psychology. And, that is perfectly adequate in its way, but I think that we ought to all review it and rethink it in terms of what we've been learning and have some conversation about it now, because when I started 3 years ago, nobody in the room knew anything about Jungian psychology, but now we have many regular members of this group who are here often. And so I thought it would be good to one time just go over sort of an overview. And the very first thing that I started with, and if you have any thoughts about that, please let me know. Alchemist's daughter says, the Ospreys sound wonderful. I live right next to a loch. I get to watch the swans raise their young every year. It's amazing. And I rest my case. We like watching swans too. And I used to have a swan picture on my Facebook page until we elected our current president. And then I changed at 12 noon on January the 20th, 2017, I changed the main picture on my Facebook page, and I hope to bring back the swans at some point. But anyway, when I started this, I started with a 45-minute talk on individuation. And the reason I did that is because individuation is a central idea to Dr. Jung's work. And it doesn't mean individualism. It doesn't mean rugged individualism. It means you becoming all you can be. I mean, the U.S. Army has a motto that they used to use. I'm not sure if they're still using it, but it was be all you can be. And that motto was developed by an Army colonel that was a personal friend of mine named Frank Burns, believe it or not. And but not the Frank Burns of television fame, but anyway, he was real Frank Burns, colonel, and he was in charge of Delta Force, but not the Delta Force of, oh God, let's go kill him now, Delta Force. He was Frank Burns of Delta, as in the triangle, Greek triangle, Delta Force, and it was about changing the behavior of the Army and how it worked. And so that's when they introduced this idea of be all you can be, because it's all about actualizing yourself. And last week I got reflecting on, why do we do this? Why are we here every week? Why am I interested in talking about this? And it occurred to me that really what we're doing is developing our attitudes toward life, toward culture and religion, toward our countries, and so on. And these things have been developed over millennia now, so that as our religions developed, they were about adjusting people's attitudes. Dr. Jung said that every major religion is a grand plan to control the comings and goings of the psyche. And so, you know, that's all well and good, except when it gets too much. And so I have a quote of his here. I'm reading from the Quotable Jung. And the Quotable Jung is collected and edited by Judith Harris, published by Princeton University Press. And she takes this paragraph out of Psychological Types, Collected Works 6, paragraph 80. Quote, Christianity, like every closed system of religion, has an undoubted tendency to suppress the unconscious in the individual as much as possible, thus paralyzing his fantasy activity. Instead, religion offers stereotyped symbolic concepts that are meant to take the place of his unconscious once and for all. The symbolic concepts of all religions are recreations of unconscious processes in a typical, universally binding form. Religious teaching supplies, as it were, the final information about the last things and the world beyond human consciousness. Wherever we can observe a religion being born, we see how the doctrinal figures flow into the founder himself as revelations, in other words, as concretizations of his unconscious fantasy. The forms welling up from his unconscious are declared to be universally valid and thus replace the individual fantasies of others. Okay, that pretty much sums it up. And so anyway, the point about being individuated is to avoid being mass-minded, because as Dr. Jung indicated, when we are in a group, our intelligence level tends to go down. And that's because, in this case, let's say, I get to do all the talking, and you folks only get to write missiles at me in the chat. And so people will listen to a leader and they say, and they'll just go along with them. And ultimately this becomes quite terrible, because we see both on the right and the left, in the case of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin at the same time, that both of them relied on mass-mindedness. One on the right, Hitler, and one on the left, Stalin, but they both ended up at the same place, which was tyranny. And so in order to avoid that, we have to avoid being mass-minded, and in order to avoid being mass-minded and just going along with the group, we have to think for ourselves, and that's what individuation is about. And so I believe it's about developing an attitude of life, and of course everyone is trying to get you to assume their attitude. Now me, I'm not trying to really persuade you in any way. You have to develop your own attitudes. I'm only pointing out the process here for you. And so and Sean says, do you think it might be necessary to at least start the route of measuring impulses? I wouldn't be surprised but what that's already happening, Sean, so you might want to check the literature on that. Mallory says, reminds me of the film Gattaca. Okay, I don't remember Gattaca. I don't remember liking it very much, but anyway. The Alchemist's Daughter says, yes, an overview would be good. I will film them for you this year and put them on my channel. Okay, that'll be great. And I'm sure you'll enjoy the various things. Let's see, it's explore.org. If you go on explore.org, you can find all kinds of these cameras, including some very interesting ones in Africa where they're at watering holes of very great animal herds. So you'll see elephants and giraffes and hippopotami all at the same watering hole. It's very, very interesting. Sean has a theory on how to solve the political divide. Well, don't keep us waiting. Sean trotted out. We need that solution. Sean, epigenetics is pretty key when it comes to many impulses. Check it out. Mallory says Frank was all that he could be, I guess. Yes, he was certainly all he could be. And that I would have to spend all evening if I told you about Frank Burns. I only knew him after his retirement, but I can tell you that in his retirement, he was wearing red frames on his spectacles, among other things. And he was heterosexual, so it wasn't about being gay. And Alchemist Daughter said, my dreams brought me to Jung originally. It was incredible to find some of what I thought were in dream figures in his writings. I was terrified and hooked from then on. Yes. And Alchemist's Daughter says, please, Sean. Sean says, if you imagine a metaphorical airplane that's goal is to increase the well-being of everyone in the world, it can't be built on the left because the left is the study of doubt, the scientific method. Sean says the right is the study of belief religion, the left is the multiplicity, the right is the incapacity. You have to build the airplane on the right because people will believe in the architecture of belief. Then you have to move the airplane over to the left and have it piloted by the left. It's sort of a Trojan horse, but this is only one solution. I wonder what the people on Ethiopian Airlines would say to that. My wife has a solution for solving the divide, and that is you take the leaders of the left and the right, and you send them all to the International Space Station with 30 days of oxygen, and tell them that they either come up with a solution or we'll bring them back in 31 days. That might work. Mallory says, Gattaca was about our culture several hundred years in the future, where all babies were genetically perfected. A notable film. Yeah, I'm sure. I hope it scares the bejeebers out of us because we shouldn't be genetically perfecting any species, really, because Mother Nature does that for us, and Mother Nature knows a lot more than we do. And we just don't know what the consequences are. I mean, you could genetically engineer people so that everybody has 2 left feet, but that isn't necessarily always good. Gray finished Catafalque. How did you like it, Gray? We're talking about Peter Kingsley's book, Catafalque, Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. And it's quite a book. As you see, I've put a lot of tabs in there. I'm working on doing a review, and I'm sure Peter would be very grateful if you would do a review of it on Amazon, Gray, and I intend to do that. And if you can't afford this book, it's actually 2 volumes, and it costs $75. Please order it from Interlibrary Loan because it will put you right in the middle of Jungian psychology and all the controversies that are just within the Jungian community, and you can take you can take a look at the first review that's under Catafalque on Amazon. It's really, in a way, a quite nasty review, in a cutting sort of way, but in fairness, Peter was goading the Jungian community quite heavily in this book, and so it's worth taking a look just to see how Peter does it. And it's an easy read. It reads quite quickly, so I urge you to take a look. And Alchemist Daughter says, stop globalist. I think you mean stop globalism. It's anti-human. Yeah, the problem is, okay, let me address that point first. We've cut a vein across the world. When we opened up the internet, we got Pandora's Box, because things just can't change that fast necessarily. We're a species that has to get it and then move on, but sometimes we take generations to get it and then move on. And so when you have societies that are far behind our society, and we have many individuals behind, and then we open up the internet and all information in the world right at the top, it's really overwhelming, and I don't think we know what the consequence is yet. But Peter Kingsley's idea is a good one, which is to, well, he says to incubate. What he means by this is not meditation, but to lie down, but don't go to sleep, and try to clear your mind and see what comes. And, over time, solutions will come that are both prophetic and useful. And this is what he says Dr. Jung was doing, and largely he's correct, because at the same time that he was writing 20 volumes of the collected works, Dr. Jung also built the Bollingen house with his bare hands, and that was a non-trivial task. And so it is possible to do. You just have to make a start, and he made 4 starts. He did it in 4-year tranches, beginning with the central part of the building, and then he kept adding on to it over a period of 16 years. And he built it literally with his own hands. He was a stonemason, of quite competent stonemason. Yes, Gray says Kingsley was not happy with the Jungians, and as you'll see from that first review on Amazon, the Jungians aren't too happy with Kingsley either, because he outed them. And the reason I say outed them is that the Jungians, for the best part of a century, including Dr. Jung himself, honestly, have been hiding the religious aspects of his work, but almost all of his work in the last 30 years was really about religion, and religion in a very broad brush. And yet what the Jungian analysts community did was they built a profession around certain aspects of his work that they could use in a profession, and they hid the religious aspects. And so it took me about, I would say, probably 25 years before I really grokked it that the work is really about religion. I started to get it when the Red Book came out, but it was even after that when I started to read the Edinger lectures or hear the Edinger lectures. And Grace says, Sean says, our economy is woven through every country. Yes, it is, but our culture is not. And when we opened up the internet, blammo, we throw our culture onto everybody. And it may not be that great to change everything that quickly. We'll see. Your generation is going to see before mine, and mine isn't going to see it. But Grace says evolution is a conservative process, absolutely. And Alchemist's Daughter, Europe has changed beyond recognition, both culture and attitude in the past 10 years. Forced globalization is the cause. It won't end well. And I agree with you. In fact, what we do know is that the Earth itself is going to be swallowed by the sun in about 4 billion years. And I doubt very much that the human species will still be alive at that point. But the question is, when things start to change, we happen to be living in the Goldilocks years. So we got the Mega Millions ticket, the $1 million chance to live a life where we have access to computers and we can talk with one another across the world. But, people 10,000 years from now may not have that choice. And that is going to cause a lot of dislocation. I mean, I keep noting one example that I'm aware of, which is that the Chinese have built 17 dams on the Ganges River above India and above Bangladesh in the Himalayas. And Bangladesh, about half of it relies entirely on the Ganges. And 250 million people in India rely on the Ganges for their water. And so if the Chinese start to siphon off that water and take it to China, there's going to be hell to pay. So Mallory says, any change not benefiting the moneyed elite is a feel-good fantasy. The Matrix is inhuman profit, not going to change in our time. Probably not. Only we can change individually, says Gray. Yes. And then we have to figure out what we can do, if anything. Sean says, I think we should institute financial studies in prisons to help prison reform. Volunteer paid experts to come visit people to reorganize their lives, having it instituted by the government. Absolutely. We also have to take another look into auditing firms because there is a lot of corruption in them, people getting paid off, etc. Definitely. Haven't we seen that in spades in the last 40 years with major auditing firms just going out of business? And teaching anybody economics would be a good idea, Sean, but also in prisons, no doubt, because what we have right now, because we've created all these for-profit prisons, is now we've created a new slave class, a new slavery. It's modern slavery because in many of these prisons, the prison earns something like 23 cents an hour from various companies to have the prisoners do work for them. And they have all kinds of things. I mean, if you talk to somebody in a call center, it may well be a prisoner that you're talking to. And that's been going on for 30 years. And so now we have this situation where we'll condemn a kid who's sold a joint to 10 years in prison, but we let Paul Manafort get away with highway robbery in the millions of dollars. It's just atrocious, and we really have to think about how to reform that, because prisons are one thing that shouldn't be for profit, because if it's for profit, then it's profitable to pay off judges to give long sentences, etc. And Grace says it's not a political problem, at least not in my opinion. Well, I think that you ought to rethink that, Gray, because everything is a political problem, but that one definitely is. The payoffs are definitely happening, and more on that later. But okay, so Dimitri, Alchemist's daughter says, Dimitri Howey is a Jungian who has been calling out this for several years. He's on YouTube. Very interesting. Okay, we'll look into that. Gray Yates, good tip. I wish there was more von Franz on YouTube. She was a force. Definitely. She died too early, unfortunately. Alchemist's daughter. Yes, we are in Pandora's box right now. The lid will be closing soon. Well, I think Pandora found she couldn't get the top back on the box. Sean, you reminded me of something. Skip the next cycle. If we can surpass being consumed by the sun, is not just if we become a multi-planetary species, but if we can become a multi-galaxy species. Yeah, certainly over time that has to happen. And but Debbie and I often listen to these universe programs, and the end game isn't good, because either the universe keeps expanding until every atom is pulled apart from every other atom, and that's called the Great RIP, rest in peace, the Great Rip, or the universe at some point starts to contract, and then we get in the great squeeze. So, but I mean, there's 50 billion years to go, so you might as well just have your breakfast and not worry about it too much. Gray, you could do some readings of Marie-Louise von Franz onto the YouTube channel, and that would replace her, or substitute for her, not replace her. She was an excellent author. And the Alchemist's daughter, that's exactly what the EU planned. Cheap migrant laborers, just wicked. I think the EU should be charged with crimes against humanity. Yeah, I saw this more than 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago now, in Germany, where they were bringing in lots of Turks at that time, as if there would be no consequence to that, but there surely is. And so now there are a lot of Turk Germans, and I'm not saying they're not good Germans, they may well be, but we do have a problem here, and especially in Europe. The U.S. currently has a little bit better control on it, but it's hard to know how to handle that. Obviously, I think the best answer is to help people where they live rather than try to build walls against them, because ultimately they'll get over walls. Last week I heard that drug dealers were catapulting bags of drugs across the wall, across the fence. So, as George Patton once said, fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of mankind. And Sean says, God's next test is Andromeda coming for the Milky Way. Well, that's a long way off, Sean. The collision with Andromeda is 2.5 million years from now, I think. And some scientists say that none of the stars or planets in Andromeda will collide with any of the stars and planets in the Milky Way because they're so far apart. That doesn't mean that there won't be gravitational issues and so on. But after my time, so sorry about that to my great going on grandchildren. Alchemist's daughter. Hope was at the bottom, remember? Ah, yes. Sean says, Hawking evaporation. I guess you mean the great rip by that. I never heard that phrase before, but it may be that. Mallory, the young seem cursed with optimism and idealism. Well, I guess you have to be optimistic if you're going to face the world and forge ahead. You have to get a life. That's what part of this lesson for tonight is. Alchemist's daughter, yes, I worked in Germany in the late 80s, and I saw this too with the Turks coming in. Germany has 1,000 of people in no better than internment camps at the moment. Shameless. Thousands of people. Yep, and we do too, unfortunately. And I learned today that we have 2,000 of them in containment to contain their diseases because they're catching the mumps and the chicken pox. So we really have to start thinking about real solutions instead of stopgap measures, band-aids. Okay, so I talked a little bit about individuation. We'll come back to it because it's a thread that runs all the way through Jungian psychology. But the next big area to think about is transformations through life. And Dr. Jung covers this in part in Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5, which was also called Psychology of the Unconscious when it was first published in 1912. And there's an excellent new version of Psychology of the Unconscious, which has some very interesting additional material in it. But Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5, is the rewrite, is Jung's entire rewrite of that book. And so you don't have to go back to Psychology of the Unconscious. The reason I like it is because there's an excellent reading of it by a gentleman named Robert Bethune on audible.com. And that was the book. But by listening to that on Audible, it allowed me to get into Dr. Jung's main work. And I have to admit that, like many people in the 1990s, I was bouncing off Jung's work because I was reading others, Campbell and Jean Shinoda Bolen and Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and I just wasn't getting around to Jung, partially because I thought it was all about clinical psychology, which was a topic that I wasn't interested in. But it's really not that at all. But you have to get access to it. You have to be able to start with it, and it is difficult. It's not something you read like a novel. So in terms of this transformation, then, we have to remember that when we're born, when we're children, we're wild animals. And how do we learn? We learn by imitation of others, first of our parents and then others. And we're born with these archetypal patterns. Now, the archetypes are instinctual patterns in our deep unconscious, and they long predate humanity itself. So, for example, there have been mothers since sex was invented in the early protozoa, and so ever since those times, has been the instinctual pattern of mother, and all of the archetypes developed long before humans ever came along as a species. But the important thing here is to think about transformations through life, and this is something that I think that we really ought to be teaching in schools, because kids don't understand it. I think if I had understood it, 35 years ago, I might have stayed with my first marriage, because I didn't understand that we have to go through, all adults have to go through these transformations. And I knew I was advancing, but I couldn't get my wife to come out of an earlier stage where she wanted me to be her daddy, and I wasn't going to be that, because her father was Mr. Fix-It, and he was always doing things in the yard and so on. And because I'm allergic to everything that's green and grows, I don't particularly enjoy yard work. And so I was never going to be her daddy. But if we had understood those things, we could have talked through those issues, perhaps. But it didn't work that way, and it ultimately caused the collapse of our marriage. But anyway, let's talk about the primary archetypal patterns that all men go through, and then all women. So all men typically, and this is typical of masculine, but it's not always the case. Of course, there's crossovers. But for men, first you're a child, and so you're just starting to learn how to be a human being. Then men become a warrior. Okay, that's the warrior archetype. And so that always seems really wonderful. And so you get the image like this, that, okay, I'm going to be a warrior. Maybe you're not going to do it in the military, but you're going to be a warrior about some topic. But in my case, and many men's cases, you get this image that you're going to be this guy in a dress blue uniform, and that's going to make you a warrior. But the problem with that is this. That's what it really is. Okay, and that's my self-portrait, which says everything I have to say about the Vietnam War. And so once you've got a snootful of being a warrior, then you have to learn what you're going to be in society. And so that means that you have to learn how you're going to be a king, and that means, by king, I mean how you're going to raise a family. And you can, there's many programs these days about the British royal family. There's The Crown, and there's Victoria on Masterpiece, and then there's recently been a couple of series about Princess Margaret, who's the Queen's sister, who died when she was 71. And from those programs, you can see that their families are very much like our families, and even worse, because they have worse requirements. And so it's not always a bowl of cherries, whether you're a king or a queen, or just a laborer who's trying to raise 2 kids or 3 kids. And so that's what but that's what life is about. And so in your earlier years, you're learning to be a human being, and then you get up to a point of maturity where you have to decide what you're going to be. And we were talking today about this movie Solo or something, about the man who climbed El Capitan without any ropes. And there are many extreme sports. So there are a lot of young people in some of your generation who are nihilists, so they can't see a meaning to their life, so they think, well, okay, I can go out and I can climb El Capitan, or I can jump out of an airplane without a parachute, which I've seen a couple of guys do, into a trampoline, including one that jumped through a hole in the roof of a warehouse into a trampoline. I mean, that was a special trick. But I also saw a video recently on Joe Rogan with a Navy SEAL who said that the first 60 guys that jumped out of airplanes with just wingsuits died. And so, okay, that gives your life a meaning too, that you've just given them a meaning to your life by dying. And so without being that extreme, you might want to just get into life and start trying to find a meaning for yourself. And so then the next layer after your family is raised, if you're following the normal process, this is a psychological archetypal process where in the third level you're raising your family, and then the fourth level is to be a wise old man. So you're a hermit, or you're Gandalf, or you're a prophet, or you're me. Because I am long past my child rearing years. My daughters are now in their 40s, except one maybe. One of them will be 40 next year, but the other two are past. And so that's quite an eye-opener when your children start to hit 40 or 50. Now, for women, the typical archetypal pattern is first you're a child, and then when you hit puberty, you become Aphrodite. That means you become very attractive, and you want to attract a mate, and most of the time women do attract a mate one way or another. And then the next phase is the queen, which is the mother, and the mother of a family, and that's a mature human being raising the next generation. And then finally you reach the wise woman stage, which is also referred to as Hecate, who was, she's a mythological figure, let's say, or the crone. So it's a wise old woman, ideally. And of course, the shadow of that is the witch, and for the shadow of the man is, of course, the abusive husband, or the godfather, who's ready to, in the case of the wise old man, the godfather who's going to rip your throat out if you don't do something. So that's the basic things that I wanted to say about the transformations through life, but that's one of the key elements of Jungian psychology. Now I'll go back and look at your comments. Let's see. Bernard says, nice art. Thank you, Bernard. You are talented. Are Jungians typically artists? Seems like it. I think a lot of them are, and I'm going to get to the point where we're talking about creativity. And this is an area where we've really shot ourselves in the foot, because our rationality has told us to get art and music out of our public schools and out of our schools. And the problem is that you have two streams coming up from your unconscious, one that's good and one that's evil. And if you have a project of any kind that's in some way creative, whether it's creating a job or doing a traditional art, or creating a family, if you're doing one of those things, then you don't tend to get into problems. But if you don't do those things, then the idle mind is the devil's playground. And so this, you have to think back on 1 John 4:1, which is a verse in which Christ says that you have to examine the spirits that are coming up from your unconscious and make a decision. But I want to get a little bit farther along on this before I get into that. But we really need artists, and we really need for all of us to think about getting into life and start doing something, anything. Start at the smallest level, even if it's, helping at the church sweep the sanctuary between Sundays or something, anything that helps to keep society going. If you're sitting at home just staring at a television, you're not controlling these spirits that are coming from the psyche, and they can definitely bring some bad stuff up. Alchemist's daughter says, I always think you look like a child lost in a giant hat in your painting. It's excellently done. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was a giant hat. And I was a child. I mean, I was, I don't know, I was 24 or 25 when the photograph was taken that that painting is from. Sean says, art is telling a story just like your self-portrait. Right. And so, yeah, the self-portrait definitely tells a story. It says everything, absolutely everything that I have to say about the Vietnam War. And that everything, just to remind you, if you don't remember it, I'll just give it back to you for a moment here. Okay. The everything I have to say about the Vietnam War is in the white of my left eye. Believe it or not. But I think you get the gist. The next day, after this photograph was taken, I was on the side of a mountain that was Hill 867, which meant 867 meters, so about a 2,000-foot tall mountain, and it was quite steep. And I had a bomb, a 500-pound bomb that had been dropped by the Americans that hadn't gone off, and the Viet Cong had rigged it to explode. And so as we were going down the mountain, it exploded right in front of the first squad, and I was just behind them. And I was very lucky because I was behind a boulder, but the 8 Marines that were in front of me were all wounded. One of them was killed, and I had to carry him 100 meters straight up to a place where a helicopter could get in and hover and bring all these wounded Marines up into the helicopter by jungle sling. So it was quite an interesting experience. And when you're in it, there's nothing you can do except live through it. And let's see. Alchemist's Daughter says, true, I don't know what I would have done without art. I just start painting or drawing, let my mind talk away without paying too much attention to it. I always feel better. And yes, I noticed the left eye, very effective and clever. So Jung's got, well, it wasn't, it's effective, but it wasn't clever. That painting was painted entirely from my unconscious, and so I can't claim any particular skill. I painted that painting with a palette knife, and but my unconscious put that left eye in there for me, among other things. And as you might guess, I mean, what I'm doing here, this is now my creativity, this YouTube channel, and this is how I'm keeping myself from going insane when things have gone badly for me economically over the last decade. So I have to have something to do, otherwise I might as well go shoot myself. And I don't want to do that. So I have, you know, sometimes I'm a writer, and I did painting for 10 years, and now I'm doing this, and this seems to serve the same function. And Metatron says, a yogi said, if a mind can concentrate on an object, continue this concentration for a length of time, and then dwell only on the internal part of the perception, this is the highest state of existence. Okay, fair enough, I agree. Okay, so the next area to talk about in Jungian psychology is the psychological types, which is volume 6, and this is entirely about developing the personality. And so within that, we have to understand that one of the tasks of youth, as you're growing up and learning how to be an adult and a mature adult, is that you have to build up a big ego. Now, this is an issue with Eastern religions because they want you to do away with your ego. And if you follow that path, that can be all right. It has some disadvantages. One of the both an advantage and a disadvantage is that the nation of India can support its population on something like $3 a day per capita, maybe less than that. It used to be $1 a day, although I think that has inflated considerably since I was first working there. So you can have a large population surviving, but it's not pushing ahead into the future. Now, India is many things, and so some parts of India are pushing ahead and are very advanced, and now they have satellites and everything else. Anyway, the point is that with the two streams that are coming up in your psyche, you need to have a strong ego in order to be able to decide which is the right one. Because these streams, one is a rational stream and one is an instinctual stream, okay, thinking and feeling. And you have to be able to decide what's the right thing for you at this moment. And so if you don't have a strong ego, you may be deciding for the wrong thing. And this is where we have problems with our religious creeds right now, because the truth of their message has been undermined by the scientific method. And so that means it falls back on each of us as an individual rather than on a creed to decide what's right and what's wrong. We can't decide on, on the basis of the Ten Commandments, and we can't decide on the basis of all good, because if we think everything is all good all the time, then something is going to come around and get us from behind really badly. And so we need to build up a strong ego, and that is done through the Job archetype, which everyone knows what I'm going to say next and put on the chat next. But the Job archetype is contest, defeat, lamentation, rebirth. And what happens is every time you go through that archetypal cycle, you strengthen your ego. And so the easiest example of that is the television program The Voice, where all these hundreds of thousands of kids, young people, think that they can be the best singer on The Voice. And so they all get to try. Most are defeated. And then they have to lament because they are defeated. But ultimately, that lamentation then will lead them to a rebirth into something that's more appropriate for their individuality, whatever that may be. So therefore, I think very highly of The Voice and the founders of that program, apparently Blake Shelton and Adam Levine, who have been running it since the beginning. And they have done a marvelous service for many, many young people who, not all of us can be a rock star and shouldn't be. But, we won't take it from our parents. So it's better if they find out that way. And so, let's see. Granad says, I don't trust yogis. And so fine, you don't trust yogis, trust yourself. That's the point. Know yourself and trust yourself. Sean says that wounds that don't heal make you whole, and that is part of the Christ image on the cross. Well, certainly Christ on the cross is about wholeness. I agree with that. I'm not sure about the wounds that don't heal. I've tried to heal a few, I'll tell you. And Alchemist's Daughter says, good art is always beyond reason. I agree. Big time. In regard to transformations, isn't the stage you perceive in the opposite sex most telling about the stage of yourself? I wouldn't, because we use self as a term of art in Jungian psychology, and I'm going to get to that in a bit, I wouldn't say that it's about yourself. It's about your own stage, perhaps, and this is why people tend to marry people that are in similar ages to themselves, because they tend to be at similar stages in transformation. It goes on, isn't it in dreams that the opposite sex appears and the stage you perceive correlates to your stage? That could be. We're going to talk about the anima here in a bit. Sean, you may not see it, but that wound has an effect on others. Wholeness is derived from the word holy. Thanks for sharing. That's an interesting idea. I like that, Sean. The Grenade says, I thought the East was about the middle way, i.e. the balance between egoism and egolessness, but the true nature is non-self. Basically, the ego should be used like a tool. At least that is how I understood it. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the objective in Buddhism seems to be to want to reach nirvana, which is pure self. And so Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger set up the ego and Christ on one end and the Buddha and the self on the other end. It's a duality that I keep thinking about. I'm not sure I have the correct answer yet, but it's something like that, right? And Grenade says, at least some sects of Eastern religion. Well, yes, they are about the middle way, typically. And that's Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism. I'm not too sure about Jainism. I don't know enough about Jainism. And Sean says, you started this channel for your grandchildren. That's still one of your purposes from the heart. Absolutely. Because, hello, grandchildren. Actually, I'm hoping that these videos survive me and that at some future date when my grandchildren are 15 or 20 years older than they are now, they'll be able to come back and see what dear old grandpa was about. So anyway, so we have this need for ego development, and that's best done by the Job archetype, which means that you need to go through this cycle as many times as possible, and that means you have to make mistakes. And so that means you can't worry about whether you can achieve an ultimate pinnacle in your career 40 years before you do. You just have to start. And it doesn't matter where you start. I mean, I started, I guess I started my real career after high school by washing toilets in an elementary school. And, you know, I just kept going, kept plugging at it, and did a lot of things in my career, and which were quite satisfying. So it's only a question of starting. And then when you make a mistake, you correct for that mistake. And I always respect people who have made mistakes because they learn from them, and then they won't make that mistake again. Good, that's one more we have under our belt. We don't have to do that again. And so you have to make mistakes, and you know, if they're big enough, you may have to lament about it. But then reborn. I mean, it could be that you get fired for making a mistake, but if you make a mistake and get fired, then you've learned something from that makes you stronger, and you can go on to the next thing. And you know, I've been knocked back many times in my career. I can't even begin to tell you how many times. You know, I just keep going, and amazingly, things happen, like this YouTube channel, which just keeps growing, and which I'm grateful for. And let's see. Sean says enantiodromia. Okay, we're going to get into enantiodromia. And Aristotle, virtue ethics. And Grenade says virtue ethics, being a human is like driving a bumper car and hoping you don't drive off a cliff. Yeah. Very much like that. Okay, so key in these psychological types and these ideas is the idea of opposites and duality. And that's obviously a major idea in Taoism and Buddhism and many other religions. And the reason the opposites and understanding the opposites is important is because between those opposites is where psychic energy happens. If you don't have the opposites, you're never going to do anything. You might as well be a stone. You might as well be a rock. And so if you want to read about psychic energy, I urge you to read Esther Harding's book, Psychic Energy, Its Sources and Transformation. And so when there are opposites, it always means there's a thesis and an antithesis. And then we get into the idea in Jungian psychology of symbols and why symbols are so important. And the reason is that we don't have an answer to a problem. So right now in the United States, we have our red state, blue state duality, which is a very serious problem. And it's thesis and antithesis. And we don't know how it's going to come out, but it will come out through a synthesis, and it will come out symbolically. And so it may come out symbolically, it certainly always comes out from a political point of view or left and right point of view every time we have an election, because the elected candidate, whoever it is on either side, symbolically represents the answer, the synthesis for that time frame. And so, the same is going on in all of the dualities that are within your psyche, and there are many, masculine and feminine, rational versus emotional, which is, thinking versus instinct type stuff. And so there's all these dualities that we deal with all the time, and they're all thrown in our psyche and mixed up, and that's where you get to alchemy. But I'm moving ahead too fast here. But anyway, the idea of opposites is hugely important. And indeed, the last major book that Dr. Jung wrote was about the opposites, and it's called Mysterium Conjunctionis. And so it's about the conjunction of two opposites and the bringing of them together. And it's quite a book. We're currently reading it in the advanced reading group. We've had 5 sessions, I believe. And it's about, it's very important because it's about imagery. And we do all of our thinking in images. And by an image, I do mean that, for example, a piece of music could be an image. It doesn't have to be a visual image. It could be an image that you hear. But we do all of our thinking based on images and imagery. And so the reason Mysterium is important is because Dr. Jung identified fundamental images that are in the human psyche everywhere. And he did that by his research into alchemy. And the alchemists were about bringing up all these images, and they were doing it at a time before epistemological criticism, which is what Dr. Jung explains, that if you know, if you write a piece of music today, somebody's going to criticize it right away, right? But with alchemists, they were not getting criticized. Typically, they were doing their work in secret, and therefore they were producing imagery that is common to all human beings. And they have different motifs, of course. You have, for example, there's a lot of imagery about the opposites, and the images can be very different depending on your society, but every society has opposites. And you can just think of the yin-yang symbol as an example. And so the significance of Mysterium is that Dr. Jung has teased out all of these, or not all maybe, but many of the basic images that are in the human psyche. And the reason he was doing that was because he was finding the same images in his patients, in his clinic in modern day Switzerland. And so here these were 20th century people who were having images that were reminiscent of the 16th century. And so that was Dr. Jung pointing out, and it's way more complicated than that because it's about this thick, okay, but it's about the fact that all human beings, regardless of our society, regardless of our religion, whatever, we all have the same basic imagery in our psyche. And that's a very important idea. Okay, let's see. So Alchemist's Daughter says, so many are annihilating their selves with Eastern practices. Yes, I think that, you know, as you may know, I live with a practicing Buddhist Lama, basically, although she's not ordained, but my wife has been to the equivalent of Buddhist Divinity School, which is a 3-year retreat, which she did. And I am not persuaded by Buddhism being the right answer. I think we need a modern answer, and our local Buddhist Lama, who is a Rinpoche, which means he's a reincarnation of someone. You know, they're teaching Buddhism in this way that it's been taught since the time of the Buddha. And we need to have something that's more in tune with what and who we are today. And that's why there are these 3 stages of religion that we're passing through, and they also represent 3 stages of psychic consciousness. The first stage being Moses and the 10 Commandments. So that's the law, the Jewish style. Then Jesus comes along and we have belief, but the problem is that Christianity left out evil, wanted to keep it right out of the system. And the problem is that then evil came around and bit us in the 20th century and killed 175 million people. And humans knew that was coming back in the 19th century, way back at the time of William Blake and others. It was well known, and Goethe, it was well known that something was not right in the psyche. And so this is all about adjusting the psyche. And that's what religions are about. But, you know, just belief in everything's going to be good and rosy that isn't going to get it, unfortunately. And so we have to face that fact. And so then the next level of consciousness is to be aware of our opposites and to be aware of how we are as human beings, recognizing the evil that we have within each of us, and then building up a strong enough ego so that we can build a civilization that we can all live in. And that's testing the spirits, as I was discussing before. And Renata, I think you might want to read the Kingsley book, Catafalque, here, because what Kingsley says, and he's an expert on antiquity, that's what his specialty is. But what he says is that it was Aristotle and Plato that led us down this slippery slope because they cut us off from instinct and insisted on rationality. And so we've gone down this slippery slope of rationality ever since their time. And so it would be probably very useful for you to read Kingsley's book. Alchemist's daughter says, polarization is happening all over the planet. It's deliberate. Yes, it is deliberate. And identity politics is no accident. Yeah, on all sides. And you see that the powers in both the GOP and the Democratic Party just throw more and more ingredients into their side, into their basket. And what ultimately happens is they get these two almost equal balls that they're trying to hold in the air. And they try to use the polarization as a way to control us. And so we have to see if we can slowly withdraw ourselves. It's not easy. I acknowledge it's not easy because I have troubles with it personally, but I would say that we have to rethink it. And, you know, I prefer to think of, you know, my fellow Marines as fellow Americans, not caring whether they're from the right or the left. And in fact, that's the law, because you're not allowed to have political activity if you're in the military, and with good reason. Andy Oxide says, scarier than our political and ideological divide is the vast and growing number of people who don't care at all about anything. And that's why, Andy, we need to encourage people that are like that to get in the game some way. You know, whatever it is, you know, they can start bowling for all I care, but anything. Because if they get in the game, then they're going to start building up their ego and to the point where they do have meaning in their life. And Bernard says, you just hear the loudest people, but there are far more silent people with different opinions and keep it to themselves. Absolutely. And so everybody does keep it to themselves to some extent. But it's important for each of us to make our own decisions and not be convinced by these jokers that are out on the television every day. I mean, they're just piling on one side or the other. They're not changing any opinions. They're just hoping that some of the young people that are coming along will start to follow their story. Alchemist's daughter, we are our own alchemical vessels. We are the temple. Exactly. Andy, they opened up a giant new Scientology center in my city, so I had to see it for myself. Talk about using symbology and archetypes to control. Totally creepy. I think so. Went there yesterday. It's like a multi-billion-dollar cult with hardly any followers, using intent to control their captive audience. Absolutely. And, you know, I saw the Mormon temple in Tokyo. I was allowed to tour it before it opened. This was in about 1981 or 82 when it opened, the Mormon temple in Tokyo. And it was the same thing. An incredible place. The Alchemist's Daughter, so true, Skip. I think Buddhism is wonderful for Buddhists and evil is real. Yes, Dr. Jung felt that Buddhism best matched his psychology and fairness. And if you look at the videos of his interviews, you'll see him walking through his home at one point, and he has a couple of very beautiful Buddhist tankas on his walls in his living room. So he was very definitely into Buddhism. But you know, there are issues about Buddhism because you know, you can't just go and sit in a corner and never do anything. That's the problem. I mean, maybe some people can. You know, Daruma and those guys can do it, you know, but most of us have to live our lives, and we have to live in the 21st century. Bernard's going to try to find an audio book. Alchemist's Daughter, not, it's definitely not easy. I swear at the news every day. And Grenade, Scientology is creepy, especially how Shelley Miscavige just disappeared. Alchemist's Daughter. Wow, Andy, Scientology has to be the creepiest yet. Well, these things pass. It may not be in a generation, but they do. Okay, so we talked about the control of the two streams of good and evil, of rational and instinct, and we have to find a balance in our life. And we need creativity, the need for creativity to control it, because if we're doing something, whatever it is, whether it's bowling or, you know, or weaving a basket or whatever it is, at least we're doing something, and that keeps your mind from being idle. And it also, I mean, if you're basket weaving, you're doing something creative, communicating with yourself when you're doing that, and that will lead you to something else. It won't necessarily be basket weaving. But ultimately, the issue is that you have to have a strong enough ego so that you decide what is right in the 21st century, because you have to live in the 21st century. Your psyche, your instinct doesn't have to. Okay, it's been developing for 3.5 billion years, and it knows what it thinks is right, but it isn't living in the 21st century. You are. And so you have to make choices based on your life. Okay, so within this psychological types issue, we have talked about the MBTI, and we've talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to go into it here in the interest of time. And so the next thing to talk about, though, is the fact that there are, in Jungian psychology, there are two centers. One is the ego, and one is the self. And the self is the boss. And so Dr. Edinger put together a wonderful diagram of the psyche, which I'm going to share with you here. Now, this diagram appeared in the ION lectures, by Dr. Edward Edinger. And he was talking about basically the structure of the psyche. And this is to help you understand. So the three circles at the top represent three different egos. One's a woman's ego, a man's ego, and a theoretically neutral ego. That's quite a theory. And then from the ego comes the shadow down, and it comes away from the light toward the self. And then you have a contact lens on top of yourself, and that's either the animus or the anima. And so you tend to see the world, or yourself tends to see the world through this contact lens, the anima or the animus. And so when I look at women, for example, as you all know, I look at them through the lens of my mother. I've shown you her picture many times, so I'm not going to worry about it here. But she, for me, she represents, perfect woman. And if you're a woman, maybe your father represents perfect man, or if not your father, someone else does. And that would be your animus if you're a woman, typically. I mean, I'm not making any judgments about heterosexuality or homosexuality, because we all can have different aspects of masculine and feminine in all of us. And I'm making no judgment about where you come down on that. But somewhere in there, you're going to have either an animus or an anima, no matter who you are. And your self, your God image, is looking at the world through that lens. Okay, so the self is also referred to as the God image, and that is because it is the deepest archetype in the unconscious, and it directs really what finally happens to you one way or another. And it's saying nothing about the metaphysical God. I mean, this is where the Jungian analysts and Peter Kingsley and even I start to get a little fussed, because Dr. Jung, throughout his career, tried to avoid saying that he was saying anything about the metaphysical God, the God of religion. And the reason he was doing that was he knew that at his time in the 20th century, 100 years ago, if he started to make statements about the metaphysical God, somebody would have either had him committed or shot. And he knew this because he was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor who had lost his faith, as it happens. And so what Dr. Jung, and so the irony of all this is that everything that we talk about the psyche is metaphysical anyway. Okay, you can't talk about the psyche without talking about something that's metaphysical, because whatever current science can say about what's going on in the brain when you're dreaming or when anything is happening, the best they can do is say, oh, this side lights up or this side lights up, but they have no idea what's going on in your psyche. And so all of it is metaphysical. And if it was physical, we'd have a natural science about it. And so the point is that the God image, the self, as it's called in Jungian psychology, it has many names. The names include the greater personality, the boss, the God image. And here's the reality. you don't know what you're going to do 2 minutes from now, okay? And yourself is going to tell you what to do 2 minutes from now, but you can't predict it. And that's the simplest way of saying it to you. And so you can't say what image is going to be in your mind 2 minutes from now or any other such thing. All those things come from the self, and they all direct your behavior. And so Dr. Jung's point was simply that the human beings cannot tell the difference between the God image and the metaphysical God. And so it might as well be the metaphysical God. And the problem that he always had in his psychology was that he couldn't make that connection between theology and his way of looking at the world. And that's the bridge that we have to make somehow. And I'm not saying I have the answer, but somehow we have to help people understand what this archetype is and how it affects our whole lives. And so I'll look for any comments you might have on Dr. Edinger's graphic here. Let's see. An alchemist daughter says, I think Buddhism without the self, well, Buddhism would be it's the pleroma. It's like, it's so far beyond the self. It's not what's in you, but it's basically mind in Buddhism. Rigpa in Buddhism is actually the pleroma, which is without time and space. It's everything. So it's pretty not clear. We're all going to get there because, as my friend says, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so one of the things we get ourselves all wrapped around a crank about is what's going to happen with us, our consciousness, after our death. And the answer is that our bodies are going to decay, and the energy that's contained in our bodies at the time of our death will pass on to other creatures and other forms of energy or matter, because E equals mc squared, and that's the way of the universe. But your spirit can live on, and there's no one that can say that Jesus Christ isn't with us today, and also Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Ludwig von Beethoven and any other person that left a large spiritual imprint on the world. We still have them. They're here. And so, that part of us, that essential part of us, which comes from the self, does continue on in one way or another. I mean, even the most milquetoast person leaves some ripples that have an effect. I mean, my mother-in-law, for example, is the kindest, sweetest, perfect mother, okay? The perfect mother archetype. And she never wanted to dare to do anything else. And she'd like to go away without leaving a ripple, but she has left a ripple. She's left and she continues to leave a ripple because she's still with us, fortunately. But she left 2 children, and her way of being in the world influences me every day. And so that influence of her being, just her being, is a ripple which affects me and affects how I interact with other people. So everybody leaves some part of their spirit for someone, and it passes into the human collective unconscious. And whether people remember your name or not, maybe not, but you're not going away. Your spirit's going to be with us for a long, long time. And I don't really care if people remember my name. It's not going to make any difference to me, but if I can influence some of you and help you along your way, I'm very pleased about that. And it seems like a few people do think that. And so Alchemist's Daughter says, Jung knew his self. He certainly did. And one of the things that Kingsley talks about in Catafalque is the fact that when Jung went to Bollingen, he put himself in his number 2 personality, which was his self. And so he would not even allow, he actually had people with him that knew this. He wouldn't even allow somebody that wasn't up to speed on Jungian psychology to even approach him when he was at Bollingen. They would have to come for a week and be communicating with the disciples, and then if they were okay, then they might be able to communicate with Jung. But Jung kept himself in this number 2 personality all the time while he was at Bollingen, but then he also stayed grounded, and that's one thing that we all have to remember. We have to stay grounded, and he stayed grounded by having an active clinical practice, by having 5 children, by having a spouse, and I'm going to say a lover, but this is where the airbrushing Jungian analysts want to pretend that Tony Wolff wasn't his lover, but of course she was, and Sabine Spielrein before her, but he stayed connected with those parts of his life as well. And Andy says, Skip, I emailed you a pic I took of a Rosicrucian relic, officially recognized by the Vatican. The center of the piece is a cross made of splinters from Jesus's cross. Very interesting. I don't know if you know his life. He ended up in what today is called Chennai, Madras, on the eastern coast of India. And so the Basilica of St. Thomas is there, and supposedly they have a piece of St. Thomas's arm bone or something. I don't know what exactly. Alchemist's Daughter says, nice explanation, Skip, thanks. I don't know what I was explaining, but I'm glad it worked for you, because when I'm doing this, I'm sort of in my number 2 personality. So when this is over tonight, I won't have a clue of what I've said. And because it all comes from my number 2 personality, and therefore my conscious mind, my ego personality, won't have any idea what's going on in this session. And then in the next couple of days, I'll have to listen to the video just so I know what I said. I think, oh my God. But the reason I've done so many videos, and there's now more than 870 of them on this YouTube channel, is because very often when I've done these things, sometimes I'll get on a riff that's 10 minutes of pretty good stuff, I think. But anyway, Andy says, maybe it was psychosomatic, but I swear I felt the belief of thousands of people for hundreds of years when I held it. Super weird. Well, that, that's a real thing, and I don't doubt that at all. And he says Edinger's chart is spot on. Reminds me of a slightly more complicated and inverted great work symbol. And Alchemist's Daughter, like you and many others, Skip, I have had too many experiences not to believe in a higher power. I think we all are looking for that. What are you doing will help many like me know they are not alone. Absolutely. And it certainly helps me to interact with you. And how did Jung deal with guilt from his affairs? That's a bit of a mystery, but the amazing thing is that he made it work, okay? And you can make it work. I mean, I think that we've gone too far in our ideas about marriage when we say, boy, one mistake, if you make one mistake with another woman, then that should be the end of your marriage. Well, that's not very good, because things happen, instincts are real, and it has to play through, and everybody has to understand what's going on, but that shouldn't be the reason for the end of a marriage, because that has caused all kinds of problems in Western society, where women have gotten to the point where they say, boy, you transgress once with another woman, and boy, that's the end of it. That's really not a very good idea, and everybody should think about that, because I think it's I don't know, is it a shibboleth, or it's a false idea that's sold to young women who think that everything is going to be perfect. And sometimes it's men too, because it's not only men that transgress, it's also women. And marriage is about something different. So how did he deal with his guilt from his affairs? I don't know, but Tony Wolfe was his analyst, and so I'm sure she was dealing with it with him and with Emma, because Tony Wolfe went to dinner at their house every Sunday for like 30 years, and they showed up, the three of them, in a menage a trois every week at the psychology club in Zurich. So, in their day and in the place that they lived, it was unusual, but it wasn't, it wasn't the end of the world. And so, maybe if one has an affair, you need the help of a psychotherapist to work through the issues and face the issues. But it doesn't mean that it should end necessarily. There can be reasons, and I won't go into these reasons, but suffice it to say that I'm in a second marriage now, and so I have a little bit of experience with this, and I think we tend to throw away marriages too easily. Sorry to say, but that's the way it is. Alchemist's daughter, help me too right after my experiences. And Alchemist's daughter says, excellent. I now have my feet back on the ground, and I never felt better, to be honest. E. Asmi says, did Jung time travel in Ravenna? Who knows? He might have. You know, there's a very interesting movie that's out just recently called the Time Traveler's Wife, and it's got 5 stars on demand. So I urge you to watch it. It's very good. It's got I think it's Rachel McAdams or something, and so it's a very nice movie. I recommend it. The Time Traveler's Wife, it's called. Mr. Asmi is referring to an incident that occurred when Dr. Jung was on a bicycle trip with a friend. The friend is unidentified, but I think it's very likely that the friend was Tony Wolff, and they were in Ravenna, and there were famous mosaics in Ravenna, and they went in and they saw the beautiful mosaics, and everything was marvelous. And then they went back to Zurich, and somebody told them that those mosaics were destroyed in like the 13th century. and they didn't see any such thing. So somehow they had a psychological leap to another time. And that's one of the more mysterious experiences of Dr. Jung's life. And I presume, and I don't know who he was with, but I presume it was Tony Wolff. Alchemist's daughter, indeed. Do you think he used his guilt to expand his ideas? I certainly think that, yes. And Andy says he easily rationalized it. Trust me. Yeah. With great insight comes great capacity to be a real jerk. Was he a jerk? Yeah, I think some people can interpret it that way. But I don't think the people at the time felt that. And, Emma, although, there's a very interesting book that I did in group in about halfway through JRG1, so you can find it on that playlist called JRG1. You can find that playlist on the front page of this YouTube channel. But there's a book that we worked on for 5 or 6 weeks about Emma Jung and her marriage to C.G. Jung, and so I would urge you to take a look at it. They had a very, very deep relationship, and I just can't express what I think about that relationship, because I've been looking at it for 30 years. And but what I would say is that Emma and Carl Jung were among the closest spouses I've ever heard of. And so that brings up the idea of rebus. Okay, so rebus, R-E-B-I-S, is an entity that is developed between individuals. We all have a rebus here because many of you are repeat visitors to this group, and so we have something that we're sharing between us. And only the people who are here and have shared this really appreciate it. I mean, the replay people can get a little of it, but they won't quite have the same reaction to what it is as the people that are live here right now in the chat. And so it's like that in a marriage, that you develop things between you that only the two of you know, and you can't possibly express them to others. And Billy Joel wrote a very good song about it. Let's see. I think it's called "You're the Only One Who Knows," and you can find it easily on YouTube. But it's Billy Joel as the singer and the songwriter, and it's about his breakup with Christie Brinkley, and he was literally in that song talking about the relationship between him and Christie Brinkley. And you know, it has this refrain in it, which is, "You're the only one who knows." And in a marriage, your spouse is the only one who knows certain things. And you know, I think it's rather arrogant of us to think we know anything about the relationship between Carl Jung and Emma Jung and Tony Wolfe and Carl Jung, and the three of them together. I don't think we have any clue, because it was such a deep relationship in so many different ways that, you know, most people don't come close to that. And so anyway, you know, was there guilt? Yeah, probably. I mean, at some level there may have been, but I don't think, you know, if we use guilt to stop us from our instincts, then we're playing into the shtick of the Catholic Church, I guess. I don't know. Let's see. Let's see. With great insight comes great capacity to be a real jerk. Okay, we said that. And so I would say, Andy, that is, you know, and he says, like King Solomon. Yep, it's also capacity to have some wisdom in life and to see life as it really is. And Bernard says, maybe jerks serve a purpose, or maybe they are just jerks. I would say that there are different levels of this in the psyche, and so we shouldn't put our template of morality upon others, and you know, especially not those others, because their relationship was so deep. And I think that Emma Jung lived herself also. They both did, and so did Tony Wolfe. So, you know, I think using the term jerks is probably a term that is at a few levels above where they were. They were very, very deep. Yeah, let's see, Andy says, in my experience, growth in this area leads to greater altruism and compassion, but the opposite is also true, a greater rationality, justified capacity for evil. Well, you know, it may be capacity for evil, or it may be capacity for good. You know, you have to decide for yourself in the exact situation. and you know, based on personal experience, I can say that there's both good and bad. When I broke up with my first wife, it meant that I did not have direct experience with the growing up years of my daughters, which was the biggest loss of my life. It's actually a very painful loss. And so, but I managed to stay close to them. And so today, when they're in, around 40, I find my relationship as strong with them as it would have been if I had been with them all their growing up years. And I still love my ex-wife. I love her like a sister. I still have respect for her and her husband and her new husband. And we have often had dinner together, the four of us. And so, these things are not black and white. And the question is, how do you deal with it? And part of that is understanding these transformational points. Bernard says, yeah, I am not aware of their relationships, only his work. To be honest, I'm not interested about his relationship. Aha. Well, it's fine to be interested in his relationship. And that's why there are books about it. And, there's a book about it, about Jung and Tony Wolfe. And you can find that, where. And I don't recall if the Jung book is there, but you can find the book on YouTube, or I'm sorry, on Amazon. And it's an interesting read and an easy read, and make your own judgments. And so anyway, let me see here. Okay, I think I'm going to stop at that point. We've gotten up to the self and to Edinger's image of the self here. I will put that image in the Dropbox so that you can download it if you want to. And next week, I will begin with where does religion fit in, and we'll talk about that. That's the last 30 years of Dr. Jung's life, but there's a lot of issues that we haven't gotten to yet. But I hope this has been useful in terms of trying to give you some sort of overall view about Dr. Jung's psychology in one place, because we've been talking about a lot of these things as we went along, but I just felt the need today that maybe we should have another conversation now that we're all more up to speed, and next week we can have a discussion on religion and the religious aspects, which is also what's in this psychology and alchemy that we've been talking about recently. But I think that would be useful. Okay, so I'm going to call it quits for tonight, and it looks like it's worked with the new technology of YouTube, so that's a good sign. And now I seem to understand how it works, so next week it should be better. And anyway, you'll see this diagram in the Dropbox for today's date, 031119, under handouts. Quite soon I'll do that this evening. And Alchemist Daughter says, got cut off from chat. That was just exactly Skip and everyone. Much appreciated. Sweet dreams, everyone. Sweet dreams to everyone. I need to get some sleep tonight. So, by the way, if you haven't looked at it, I urge you to take a look at the series I've been doing on the UFOs, because Dr. Jung's essay on UFOs, or flying saucers, things seen in the sky, is a very, very interesting essay. And I had avoided it because I thought it was a little airy-fairy for an 82-year-old man to be writing about UFOs. But actually, it's not about physical UFOs at all. It's really about UFOs as they come up in the psyche in various ways. And so in that sense, it's like religion, because as you remember the point I keep emphasizing from paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche, not a statement of the phasis. And so Dr. Jung's pointing out that most UFO reports, if not all of them, are also statements of the psyche. And, he's not ruling out the possibility that we may have a physical contact at some point, but so far as we can prove, there haven't been. And it's pretty far-fetched when you think about it, because the nearest planet that would have anything like what we would need to survive is 20 light years away, as we've now discovered, and at the fastest speed of anything that we've ever sent into space, which is the Horizon spacecraft that went to Pluto, which travels at about 35 miles a second. At that speed, it would take 500,000 years to get to that planet, 20 light years away, because that's 120 trillion miles away. It's a long way. We live in an isolation ward, as my wife says. So, thank you, Mr. Osme. And yes, I've been listening to that yesterday. Wow, it's very heavy. We'll keep trying. I listen especially to number 5. That's a very, very, very powerful one, I thought. And I was less impressed with the part about painting, but number 5, which is still in dreams, he had some very, very poignant things to say about our current politics. So I urge you to take a look at that. So anyway, all right, now I'm going to stop. So I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about the religion part in an over